good afternoon and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. One of the benefits of having a Zoom function, it seems like, and a Zoom audience is that we can address everyone around the world at different times. I hope that you're all staying safe and healthy during this difficult coronavirus situation that we find ourselves in. If some of you don't know me yet, my name is Shabnam Nassimi, and I am the Executive Director of the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. For everybody watching, we do invite you to take part in the discussion today and send us your questions. After my introductions of the topic that we'll be discussing and just a brief intro of the organization, we will be speaking with our distinguished panel discussants who will present their perspectives on the topic, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. So let me begin by introducing the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, which is an influential British lobby group based in London and supported by a wide range of British parliamentarians. Our mission is to provide independent analysis and engage in campaigning, advocacy, policy work and lobbying to improve understanding of Afghanistan's complex context and propose new mechanisms and solutions through influencing decision makers within the UK government and internationally. We aim to provide fair representation for the needs of all Afghans and develop innovative narratives to create a more positive and more democratic future for the country. The UK's foreign policy on Afghanistan is a sort of the core tenet of CFA's priorities, and the organization is very active at every level of the UK government and is widely known as one of the leading political groups led by the Afghan diaspora in the UK, working to inspire change and progress in Afghanistan. As you know, you're all aware from the title of this today's topic, corruption and fighting corruption will be the focus of what we'll be addressing. Corruption is an incredibly important indicator of weak political institutionalization in Afghanistan. Institution building has been at the heart of internationally funded efforts since 2001. The dangers of corruption were anticipated during the refounding of the state after 2001. A volume of papers were presented by international experts for the Constitutional Drafting Commission to be able to look forward in terms of what position anti-corruption reform and policies and measures will have on a new constitution. However, despite this advice, the 2004 constitution contains no anti-corruption provisions or institutions, only mentioning the issue once and then in a desultory manner. Whether the constitutional provision would have limited the problem of corruption or not can be debated, but what cannot be debated is that corruption has paralyzed the country, and Afghanistan has been consistently ranked among the 10 most corrupt countries in the world by Transparency International. It has consistently been mentioned by the people of Afghanistan as one of the biggest frustrations of their daily lives. It's an endemic that has penetrated all parts of the Afghan state and adversely affecting the ability of Afghanistan to maintain security for its citizens and deliver basic public services. It's also affected confidence of donors and international funders at a time when the lifeblood of the state was, and as it remains, is external funding. And when increasingly disputed elections undermine the domestic political legitimacy of the state. And to look more closely at the progress of anti-corruption reforms and provide analysis and recommendations to support Afghanistan's institutions in combating corruption, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan recently released its 4th annual anti-corruption report on June 18th. The report describes how anti-corruption reforms have slowed down since 2019, with fewer legislation and strategic initiatives being undertaken to fight corruption than in previous years. It also outlines how Afghanistan's 2017 anti-corruption strategy, which was temporarily a policy document, ended without a successor. And in addition to, the report notes the institutional gap left by a stalled progress in both strategy and implementation were not filled by the expected establishment of an independent anti-corruption mission. So that is sort of the context of the situation. I'm going to now introduce our panelists, who will be providing their commentary and analysis on this subject matter. First of all, we have Scott Smith joining us from the United States Institute of Peace as a senior expert on Afghanistan peace processes. He was previously the USIP's Afghanistan and Central Asia programs, the director of that, and also the director for political affairs of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. He's also the author of Afghanistan's Troubled Transition, Politics, Peacekeeping, and the 2004 presidential elections. We are also joined by Mr. Mujib Shirzad, who is the Deputy Director of the Supreme Audit Office of Afghanistan, speaking to us and joining us from Kabul. So thank you for that, sir. We will also be speaking hearing from Dr. Tabassum Aksir, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Asia Foundation, Afghanistan's office. She oversees the Foundation's annual survey of the Afghan people, one of the broadest and longest running public opinion surveys in the country. And finally, Andrew Watkins, who's the Crisis Group Senior Analyst for Afghanistan. He focuses on prospects and challenges for a peace process in the Afghan conflict. He's worked also as a political affairs officer for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. So without further ado, and taking any more of our guest time, I'd like to ask for our panelists to begin and provide us their opening remarks on the subject, and then we'll go from there. If we can start with Scott, that will be perfect.
Thank you, Shabnam. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for hosting this session on anti-corruption, and in particular on UNAMA's anti-corruption report. You mentioned I had been the Director of Political Affairs, and in that capacity, I had overseen the production of last year's, or the year before's, anti-corruption report. And a huge amount of work goes into this. And if you read the report, you'll see the immense amount of detail in terms of number of meetings, dates of decrees, and so forth. I think that's an extremely valuable service, that this information is being recorded and memorialized, because corruption is, as I believe you said, probably the single most important issue affecting the future of Afghanistan. And that's why UNAMA's report is very aptly subtitled, Fight Against Corruption, Crucial for Peace and Stability. Why is it so important? First, corruption has been recognized as a source of the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan, in part because corruption alienates certain members of the population who join the insurgency. But it also undermines the government's own ability to get the upper hand in the fight against the Taliban. And US defense officials, for example, who I've spoken to, constantly refer to this, that frontline troops are not getting the equipment and reinforcements that they need. Oftentimes, positions that are attacked by the Taliban are, for that reason, given up by government soldiers. And it must be also exceedingly demoralizing to fight for a state or military hierarchy that demonstrably doesn't care if you're risking your life to defend it. And then finally, and you also mentioned this, it's an existential issue for Afghanistan because of the ongoing loss of donor confidence and the fact that Afghanistan heavily depends on donor money to fund itself. And in particular, the realization in the United States that the government would probably not be able to prevail militarily And the growing frustration that it's throwing good money after bad led it to its decision to open direct negotiations with the Taliban in 2018, leading to the situation we have right now where the US is putting pressure on the Afghan government to negotiate with the Taliban in order to end the conflict. But this is obviously a suboptimal outcome, depending on where we hoped we would be at this point in time some years ago. Now, the other interesting thing is it's not as if the government doesn't understand the immensity of this problem. And a few days ago, USIP hosted a discussion that was presenting this year's World Justice Project survey on Afghanistan, which talks about the rule of law, but also corruption. And the WJP report writers said the same thing that we experienced in UNAMA, which is there's a high level of cooperation from the government in the preparation of these reports. They're contributing information, they're responding to our questions, and this is very positive. And they do this even though they know the results of the report are likely to be critical, and in this case for UNAMA, they were critical. And they didn't complain either when it was released with this message that there's been some backsliding on anti-corruption reforms. So we have to ask ourselves why, if the government is aware of the problem of corruption, it has had so little ability or made so little effort to actually deal with it, especially given that it is, as I've described, existential. So I think there are 3 points I wanted to make on this. First is what might be called Machiavelli's dilemma. So Machiavelli pointed out that no one is more vulnerable than a reformer because reforms will immediately attack the real interests of a certain class. So they have a direct interest in uniting to block the reforms. At the same time, those who would benefit from the reforms see those benefits as distant and hypothetical, and there's not as strong incentive, therefore, to back those reforms. So the reformer is always in this position of having very little support and having significant opposition. Now, 2 points of data to reflect this. According to the WJP report that I just mentioned, 45% of Afghans say they've had to pay a bribe to access government services. So that's a massive constituency, millions of people that would benefit from anti-corruption reforms. At the same time, the Anti-Corruption Monitoring and Evaluation Commission a few days ago reported that the amount of bribes in Afghanistan in 2018 amounted to $1.6 billion. This is more than the government collects in taxes. So you can see that the much smaller number of people who are benefiting from that 1.6 billion presents a powerful constituency to oppose reforms. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to make progress. Second, there's a problem in institutional design, and here in particular, the immense powers of the presidency with few checks and balances, either from parliament or from independent institutions. And this was a conscious decision made. You had mentioned the Constitutional Commission in 2003, a conscious decision made at that time to make sure there would be a strong central power that would be able to bring the country together. But I remember the Australian scholar William Maley pointing out at the time that when the Constitution was ratified, he said this was a constitution not for all time, but for President Karzai. And there had been the hope that President Karzai would use these powers in a way that unified the country and consolidated institutions, but instead he used them in ways that made the corruption problem much worse and now much more difficult to bring under control. Earlier UNAMA reports did show some progress in the first several years of the Gandhi administration and the National Unity Government on the anti-corruption agenda, but as you saw and you mentioned it, this year there's been some backsliding. Third, there's still a great deal of lack of trust in Afghan society. Obviously trust among each other, but most importantly in this context, trust in the future. We in the West see our engagement in Afghanistan as having been 20 years, now too long. Our patience is exhausted. We've wasted resources, and now it's time to leave. I think from the Afghan perspective, they see it differently. They've heard almost from the beginning a narrative of withdrawal. So after in 2003, the invasion of Iraq looked like a distraction. In 2005, after the parliamentary elections were held, there was already this sort of mission accomplished rhetoric. In 2010, when President Obama announced the surge, he declared at the same time that troops would begin to be withdrawn 18 months later. In 2014, we had the transition, a further withdrawal of troops and the end of the international combat role. And now we have this peace process, and even President Trump signaling that he would like all troops to leave by November. So I remember 10 years ago, Ashraf Ghani obviously before he became president, saying that the West had not fought a 10-year war in Afghanistan, it had fought 10 one-year wars. So if you're an Afghan trying to make rational decisions and all you're thinking about or all you're hearing is the international community saying we're about to leave, then the rational thing to do is to hedge your bets, accumulate resources, and put yourself in a better position for whatever comes next. And that's sort of been a pattern, I think, that has been happening for many years. But given that rationality, and this will be my final point, there has still been an almost grotesque element to some of the worst corruption that we've seen in Afghanistan, which has contributed to the loss of confidence. The collapse of Kabul Bank, with nearly $1 billion stolen, was stunning for its magnitude. The really heartbreaking scandal of the military hospital, where there are reports of wounded soldiers paying bribes to get a drink of water or a bandage or an aspirin. Now, the apparent corruption surrounding the distribution of COVID-related aid, where again, you see a sort of lack of solidarity while facing a national crisis that is literally killing people. So corruption in this sense is more than a financial issue. It affects lives, and the way that it makes it harder for Afghans to trust each other in the future is another reason, I think, for describing it as an existential issue. So the UNAMA report, I think, contains a number of very solid recommendations. These should be considered. I think the government is running out of time to tackle the issue, but for the sake of the future, it must be tackled in some way and in a more decisive way than it has been in the past year, as the report describes. So thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Scott, for that extensive analysis of the ground reality and the report that UNAMA has presented in the last couple of weeks. We'll now move on to Mr. Mujib Shirzad on his outlook of the situation. And as the Deputy Director of the Supreme Office, Audit Office of Afghanistan, I think you'll probably be able to give us a more clearer picture of what is going on in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Again, hello everybody, and also hello to all those people who watching this program live and or will watch this program later. Thank you, Shabnam, for hosting this program and also for providing this situation, bringing different actors together to discuss the anti-corruption efforts in Afghanistan. It's very concerning and very disappointing that despite 2 decades of anti-corruption efforts, still Afghanistan remains one of the top countries in the anti-corruption, corrupt countries list. Let's confess that especially during the last 5 years, lots of efforts has been done by the government, anti-corruption efforts. Establishment of ACJC, establishment of High Council of Anti-Corruption, Rule of Law, so the National Procurement Agency, money reforms, anti-corruption strategy, prosecution of high-ranked government officials, ministers, 3-star generals, and many efforts. But still, fighting corruption remains a truly fundamental necessity in Afghanistan. In order to ensure the integrity, accountability, and transparency to the donors who provide technical and financial assistance to the country and also to the public. Let me look to the latest anti-corruption report of the UNAMA. So the report measures the progress of Afghanistan government anti-corruption reforms and efforts. Also providing some recommendation to different institutions to fight corruption. But let me say that the corruption is not, as you said, endemic. We cannot say corruption is just available in Afghanistan. Corruption is a pandemic. Corruption is everywhere, but at different level and different types. My personal point of view is that somehow corruption in Afghanistan is exaggerated or overstated also. Because when you see the media going to the city and just interviewing people, and they are saying there is corruption, corruption, and corruption. So most of the reports provided and most of the activities, especially civil society or international organizations or international community, is merely putting pressure on the government of Afghanistan or pressurizing the government. But my recommendation is that instead of pressurizing the government or criticizing the government, why we do not help the government of Afghanistan fight corruption? Like, I have not seen any reports or any analysis or any research to tell us that which type of corruption is available in Afghanistan. To which extent? What is the motive or the causes of that corruption? Why that corruption continues? Who are behind that corruption? Why anti-corruption activities are not useful, not successful? I'm looking for that types of report to help. Otherwise, if we say that corruption still continues, corruption is available, Afghanistan is in 10, in 11 or 12 in the list, it will not help. Let's help government of Afghanistan, fund government of Afghanistan, different institutions, provide financial and technical support and international know-how experience how to fight corruption. Also, let me say that for fighting corruption, security, stability, and rule of law is very important. While we are living in a situation of very fragile political stability, there is security problem and many more problems. So how we expect that anti-corruption activities will be very successful? So I think the expectation of the international community for government of Afghanistan is also very high. And the goals and objectives set for anti-corruption by the government of Afghanistan is also very ambitious. Anti-corruption activities takes time. It takes time. We cannot fight corruption overnight. Despite government of Afghanistan is busy in many more areas. So it does not mean that we gave immunity to anti-corruption agencies or to government of Afghanistan not to fight corruption, but it means that let's be very realistic in measuring corruption in Afghanistan and for anti-corruption activities in Afghanistan. Also, let me at this point to introduce you the Supreme Audit of Afghanistan. The Supreme Audit Office of Afghanistan is the Westminster model or Supreme Auditor General model, which is the same in the United Kingdom. And so we are conducting public audit, 4 types of audit: financial audit, compliance audit, performance audit, and also IT audit and some new emerging audits. Newly, we have started very drastic reforms in Supreme Audit of Afghanistan. And the government of Afghanistan has been very supportive in supporting the ACO implementing their reforms, like the revision of the new audit law, according to the international standard of INTOSAI, which provide independence to the ACO, immunity for tenure of Auditor General for the auditors, and many more. The functional review of the Supreme Audit Office and reorganization of the Supreme Audit Office according to the result of the functional review, and provision of resources and more staff to Supreme Audit of Afghanistan to do the public audit. This is one of the government support anti-corruption activities. So, but there are still, why corruption available in Afghanistan? What's the main causes from my point of view? So during the last 2 decades, there were many institutions established or created to fight corruption with a very not clear mandate. Also, there were overlapping of activities. Between different agencies, not clear mandate of different agencies. The culture of immunity, warlordism in Afghanistan, also one of the main causes of corruption. Let's say how to best what's our recommendation to best fight corruption in Afghanistan? One is institutionalization of the corruption activities. There might be some specific institutions with a clear mandate to fight corruption in Afghanistan, and supporting political will and supporting those institutions to fight corruption, independence of anti-corruption agencies, and provision of sufficient resources for anti-corruption agencies are very important. The cooperation and coordination between anti-corruption agencies, governmental, local, and international, is very important. So let me say that if we pay attention to budget of Afghanistan, so there are off-budget funding and on-budget funding, also discretionary budget and indiscretionary budget. So the government control is on those parts of the budget which is on budget and discretionary budget, but there is no control over ODA, which is off budget or indiscretionary. So no report says, or no study or research says that how much corruption is available on those parts, which is not.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Shirzad. It's just because we're going to need a bit more time for questions and answers, so we'll come back to you on. You can outline that in a bit more detail for us in the questions and answers. If I can go on to move on to Andrew from the crisis group for us to provide his analysis on the subject.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Shabnam, for inviting me and for having us all for this very important discussion. It's great to be here with the other panelists. Both you and Scott have referred back to the absence of addressing corruption in certain ways, and this made me reflect on the development of Afghan governance and what has led us to this point that I think has direct relevance to some of the UNAMA report's recent findings. And so just very quickly, I want to run back to 2004 and to reflect on whether it was the international community's role in Bonn, or whether it was among Afghan stakeholders in the country. The greatest issue at that time was not the insurgency that has split the country in half today and that has made Afghanistan once again the world's deadliest conflict. At the time, the concern was bringing together far-flung and diverse factions of former Mujahideen leaders, really trying to find a center of gravity in a political landscape and a landscape of armed actors to try and make some sense of it and to bring it together, to coalesce this into a functioning state. And so the approach, not only in Bonn and not only in the drafting of the Constitution, but in President Karzai's approach throughout most of his tenure, was to bring in as many stakeholders who had the capability to use through either armed force or other measures outside of the rule of law to defy the authority of the state, to simply bring them into the state. whether officially as ministers themselves or by less official means, but we had a strategy of bringing all the stakeholders into the tent to take part. And a variety of corruption, and corruption at staggering levels, as Scott has run through the history, began to ensue. President Ghani has taken, since 2014, a distinctly different approach. And this goes back to something else that Scott mentioned, how no one is more vulnerable than a reformer. There have been high level and dramatic attempts by President Ghani and the administration to combat corruption, and sometimes indeed at very high levels. He came into the scene with the support and the praise of the international community as the reform candidate. And he declared that his presidency would be a reform presidency. And indeed, there were moves taken against notable power brokers who hailed from an earlier era of Afghan politics and conflict, like even his vice president, Dostum. And in 2018, there was another challenge to a key power broker in the north, Ata Noor, in Mazar-e-Sharif, the former governor of Balkh. So a president as a reformer who was already more vulnerable than perhaps anyone else has become even lonelier and a bit more vulnerable as he has attempted to make moves in Afghanistan's political landscape. Part of the problem, and something that is highlighted in UNAMA's most recent report, is that this has had an effect on the government's efforts. One thing that the report notes is that Afghanistan's Anti-Corruption Justice Center, it heard more cases. The court oversaw and made rulings on more cases this year, in 2019, than it did the year prior. The problem was the average ranking of the corrupt official who was put on trial dropped to a much lower level. When the Anti-Corruption and Justice Center began hearing cases, people at the minister and deputy minister level were being put on trial. And this was indeed part of a full faith effort. But as President Ghani encountered greater and greater difficulties, as he became, in the words of the Machiavellian maxim, more vulnerable, and had to rely on the people he had brought into his team, the ranking of people who went on trial for anti-corruption dropped to a much lower level. And it was more junior officials who were being tried, while, as we see in the media and in Afghan civil society today, there are huge questions about ministers. The former Minister of Finance, Qayoumi, and in fact, 5 other former ministers who are accused credibly of large-scale corruption, but have not yet been charged, and the Justice Center has not yet heard or reviewed their cases. And so this is, for me, where the political landscape and the conflict landscape and the challenges that Afghanistan's political leaders have dealt with come into contact with the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of attempting to implement corruption. I know we have plenty of time, and we still want to hear from Dr. Aksir. So I'll hand it over, and we can continue this in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your perspective on that, and we'll definitely broaden the discussion a little later. Dr. Tabassum Aksir, I'll turn to you now.
Thank you, Shabnam. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here to help contribute to such an important discussion amongst our expert panelists, co-panelists. As UNAMA's anti-corruption report highlights, corruption, of course, continues to plague Afghanistan's many attempts at peace and prosperity. This year, as my co-panelists have mentioned, Afghanistan continues to be ranked amongst the most corrupt countries in the world. So while my co-panelists are better positioned to discuss corruption in Afghanistan in broader terms, I'll offer a perspective that's based that's more data-driven. Using our annual survey of the Afghan people data, I'll highlight the perceptions of Afghans on corruption in Afghanistan, in their daily lives, and in their interactions with the various institutions. I'll also shed some light on how these experiences and perceptions of corruption impact Afghans overall in their relationship with the judiciary, their relationship with democracy, with elections, with migration, and even the peace talks. Before I get into the data, it's really important to understand where it's coming from. The survey of the Afghan people is the longest running barometer of public opinion in Afghanistan. It's been running since 2004. We've interviewed almost 130,000 people on a variety of topics, not limited to corruption, but also including governance, security, migration, women's rights, access to information, and so on. In 2019, we interviewed almost 18,000 Afghans across the country between July and August, just prior to the presidential elections in the end of September. So the data that I'll share reflects that specific period of time. Interviews were conducted in person, and we also included a comprehensive set of independent third-party monitoring and additional comprehensive mechanisms to ensure that the data that we received and collected was reliable and accurate. I can provide more information on that, on the data reliability during the discussion or the Q&A if you're interested. The entire data set is available online. So to help contextualize how general perceptions or populations perceive corruption in Afghanistan as a whole, it's important to think about the general optimism and pessimism in the direction of the country. So we ask Afghans whether or not the country is heading in the right direction or the wrong direction. 36% say that the country is heading in the right direction, and an overwhelming 58% say it's heading in the wrong direction. So when we ask further, amongst those who say that the country is heading in the wrong direction, we ask why. The top three cited reasons are insecurity, followed by unemployment, and then corruption. And this also includes administrative corruption. Since 2006, we've been asking Afghans about their actual perceptions of corruption, whether it's a major problem, minor problem, or not a problem at all in Afghanistan and then in their daily life. Overall, an overwhelming 82% say that corruption is a major problem in Afghanistan as a whole. There are differences both regionally and provincially. So we've seen perceptions of corruption increase in the Southwest and in the East. And then provincially, we see almost 97% of respondents in Panjshir saying that corruption is a major problem, whereas we see the lowest in Paktia with only 50% of respondents. We also see differences by strata, with urban respondents more likely to say that it's a major problem, and also by gender, with men more likely to say that corruption is a major problem. We also ask in a different lens about corruption in daily life. So we ask Afghans about their personal interactions and whether or not they've experienced corruption. 68% say that they have, and it is a major problem. 68% say that it is a major problem in their daily life, and 23% say it's a minor problem for them. And of course, similar regional and provincial differences also exist. Urban residents are more likely to say that corruption is a major problem in their daily lives than rural respondents, and we attribute these differences to the more frequent contact that urbanites might have with government officials and institutions. This might result in higher expectations that bribes will be necessary simply to navigate an urban setting. And in an effort to identify the various sites of corruption, we also ask Afghans how often they encounter corruption or how often they're expected to give a bribe in order to receive a certain service amongst various authorities and institutions. And depending on the institution that we asked about, the experiences of corruption vary. So Afghans are most likely to say that they experience corruption in the judiciary at around 53%, followed by the customs office, the municipality district office, the governor's office, and unfortunately, given the high unemployment rates, even when applying for a job. The least frequently cited location where respondents reported experiencing corruption was with the Afghan National Army at only 31%. The UNAMA report references SAP data to echo a lack of confidence in judicial institutions. And indeed, 66% of our respondents say that state courts are fair and trusted, and only 53% found them to be effective in delivering justice. Drawing again on SAP data, the UNAMA report also shows that the population's trust in the informal justice system is still significantly higher, with 81% of respondents say that they trust the local shuras and jirgas, and 74% saying that these informal mechanisms are more effective at delivering justice than the formal mechanisms. To push this point further, when we ask Afghans, if you were a victim of violence or crime, or a criminal act, how much confidence would you have that the government, law enforcement organizations, and judicial systems would punish the guilty party? Nearly 1/3 of respondents say not very much at 30%, and 14% say that they have no confidence at all. So the impact that perceived corruption has in government institutions, in the perceptions of government institutions, and in the impact of experiences of actual corruption, have a range of effects, not just limited to what I described as a failure to report violent acts or crime, but also ranging from voting behavior, the desire to leave the country, support for peace, or even support for a family member to join the Afghan National Police. In fact, when we ask Afghans, would you agree with a family member's decision to join the ANP, more than 1/4 disagree and say that they wouldn't support such a decision. And in a follow-up question on why, 13% that they say that there's too much corruption. So in another lens, public opinions or expressions of concern over electoral fraud, corruption, and mismanagement is also evident in our data. On the topic of elections, among our respondents, at the time of the field work, we had just finished the parliamentary elections, so we asked whether or not they had voted. 59% said that they had, and amongst those who said that they didn't vote, in a probe asking for reasons why they didn't vote, the most common reasons were insecurity, fraud, it's not beneficial, and injustice. A majority of Afghans, more than half, also say that fraud undermines free and fair elections, followed by corruption and insecurity. The survey asks respondents whether or not they've voted at the time for the upcoming elections, upcoming presidential elections. The number of Afghans who said that they didn't vote, we asked why not. And amongst these respondents, the most common reasons were insecurity, followed by it's not beneficial, and then fraud. On the topic of migration, we also see a correlation between Afghans' experiences of corruption and the desire to migrate. So when we ask Afghans whether or not they would leave the country if given the opportunity, amongst those who say that they would leave, after insecurity and unemployment, weak governance, this includes corruption, injustice, and high prices, is the third most cited reason for wanting to leave the country. And finally, experiences of corruption also have an impact on peace. Respondents who say that they gave money or a gift to any institution, for example, the municipal district office, the police, the ANP, the state electricity supply, they're less likely to be optimistic about the possibility of peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban compared to those who have not experienced corruption. Another example, amongst respondents who said that they gave money when applying for a job, they're also less likely to say that peace is possible compared to those who say that they didn't experience such a thing. So in summary, while the SAP data is quite vast, there is quite a bit that could be done with it. What some of the talking points that I've shared really point to is just simply the pervasiveness of corruption in Afghanistan across the many institutions and the impact of fraud and corruption on Afghans' perceptions. With the hopes of a peace deal on the horizon, measures on remedying corruption can establish fertile grounds to push forward what UNAMA calls for in their resolute and persistent actions to address corruption offenses for a variety of sectors, and that anti-corruption norms are applied equally.
Thank you so much to each and every one of you for the extensive and detailed perspective on the subject matter. Let me begin by posing a question to each of the panelists while we gather the full range of questions for the audience. Scott, I think I'll start with you, if that's all right. There have been reports that the Taliban and other fighters have underscored the government's corruption, using it as a mechanism to undermine public support for the government, garner recruits to their cause, and weaken the government's position. Since March, Afghanistan has reported more than 32,000 COVID-19 cases, including 800 deaths, but testing has severely limited, and experts say that the number of infections are likely to become much higher than that. The frustration has been that billions of aid has been invested into the government, into Afghanistan to fight the pandemic, but it's been wasted, and corruption has been brought further to light over the last few months. I think it is the most insidious threat that the government faces, because it saps the support of the citizens who are trying to go about their daily work, feed their families, and live free of fear of intimidation and sort of poverty. To what extent do you think is systematic corruption within the Afghan government weakening its bargaining position in the upcoming peace negotiations with the Taliban?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's unquestionable that this perception, which is based on a reality of a corrupt government, is weakening its position. Now, you mentioned at the beginning of your question that, you know, the Taliban contention that the government is corrupt and using that in order to gain its own popular support. We can link that briefly with what Tabassum had said about the perceptions of government justice compared to traditional justice or Taliban provided justice. And we've seen numerous reports suggesting that people prefer the Taliban provided justice because it does come across as less corrupt, and because its verdicts are enforceable. So these are sort of second line criticisms of the Taliban, by the Taliban, of the Afghan government. The top line criticism, of course, is this government is illegitimate because it was brought by foreigners and is supported by foreigners. So when you add their illegitimacy narrative to the also incompetent and also corrupt and unable to meet your needs, I think that they've used that with an increasingly effective propaganda, I'd say, aimed both at the West and at Afghans, to make this case. And I think, to give you one example, and I saw in one of the comments somebody mentioned the link between democracy and corruption. And the UNAMA report describes one of the few successful prosecutions of high-level people were the prosecutions of all the electoral commissioners from the 2018 parliamentary elections. But I was speaking to a Western diplomat who has fairly regular contacts with the Taliban Political Commission in Doha, and he said, you know, we were talking about what might come out of a future negotiation, what are the parameters of a political settlement, and he said, right now, if you mention democracy to the Taliban, they laugh in your face. And to some extent, you can't blame them, because the state institutions had done such a bad job. And then we saw the reduced turnout in the presidential election, which seemed to be somewhat better managed than the parliamentary election. But this is the government on issues of governance has created a much more difficult position to defend when it comes face to face with the Taliban. The Taliban have the advantage of not really having to be responsible for governance, but the government it's taken it on, it's received resources to do it, but it has a hard case to sell, both on democracy, on accountability, when it faces the Taliban, who will, we know, present a vastly different and far less representative and accountable form of government. So it does have a major effect, I think.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that. The next question, I guess, will be targeted at Andrew. This is such a complex matter, and I think what we've seen is that the government and the international community continue to put the blame on each other for this problem. I think the system has been built in Afghanistan since 2001, can be seen as part of the problem. You know, for instance, you know, I've witnessed and you know, quite disturbed to see top international organizations and officials failing to be on the same page about what the strategy should be in confronting this challenge. I mean, for example, an element of the broader problem, for instance, is that the US military deployment in certain parts of Afghanistan, for instance, south of Afghanistan, depends on certain Afghan contractors and Afghan strongmen disproportionately. And in the interest of trying to meet deployment schedules, and this is the same as well for international funders and donors, trying to meet a certain target and outcome, you know, you rush and work with the same people that you already know, pumping more money into the same hands that are already benefiting from the system, to the exclusion of the broader Afghan population. You know, how much do you think is this so-called patronage to certain leaders and networks that the international community have had? To you know, how much of it to what percentage are they to blame for the corruption crisis that we're facing, and how can aid moving forward be better distributed to be better equitable and reach a broader base of people?
It's a great question. I don't want to give an exact percentage of which party is to blame, but I think we all agree that there is far too much blame to pass around to everyone who's been involved with the project of attempting to stand up an Afghan government since the American and Western intervention in 2001. Mujib made a really fascinating comment that is worth dwelling on for a moment when he said, if Afghanistan does have corruption problems, now is not the time for the international community to simply level criticism and then also speak about their desire to leave. Now is their time to do even more to help. And this struck me because of something that the American Secretary of State Pompeo did last year, before peace talks had reached the stage that they're at now. But late last year, the American State Department threatened to cut funding to the Afghan government, and specifically to the Independent Joint Anti-Corruption Monitoring and Evaluation Committee, the MEC, because of concerns about corruption. The American government's response to concerns about corruption was to cut funding to Afghanistan's anti-corruption bodies. And so it's true in so many ways and at so many points throughout this project, and not just throughout the conflict, but throughout the support provided by the international community. The international community, whether it's the American government or more broadly, has stopped and gotten cold feet, let's say, about making the kind of decisive action that would be required to readjust the Afghan government and the international community's approach, without the threat of pulling support away, which is this anxiety-inducing moment where we're at now. Whereas we've all said there's this great attention to corruption and the scale and scope of the problem, but also is now the time to simply be focusing on the criticisms if we're also having a discussion about international patience wearing thin and the money potentially drying up?
Thank you, Andrew. The next question I'm going to ask Mr. Mujib Shirzad. You've briefly explained exactly the responsibilities of the Supreme Audit Office and what your responsibilities are in countering corruption within the Afghan government. From your experience and what you're working on at the moment, you know, what sort of reforms have already taken place? What initiatives are in place to manage corruption within institutions and the government, and how effective do you think it will be?
Thank you. As I mentioned before, starting from Supreme Audit of Afghanistan, so the reforms here, the law revision, audit law revision, the functional review, the institutional reorganization of the Supreme Audit Office, professionalization of the Supreme Audit Office. We have newly started the Certified Government Auditor Institute inside the organization. Adapting e-size and into-size standard, and hiring and attracting international auditors, as international certified auditors into the system to conduct standard auditing. These are the reforms taken inside the Supreme Audit of Afghanistan. So generally in the country, like lately, establishment of a High Council of Anti-Corruption is underway. Also the new organization called BASRAS is established to monitor the complaints against high government officials. The Afghanistan anti-corruption strategy itself is the reforms and the efforts of the government made in this part. But still there is long way to do and to work. But again, I am insisting on
I think we may have lost Mr. Shirzad, but hopefully he might be able to come back on with us shortly. So we'll come back to him if he is able to rejoin us. I'm going to ask the next question finally from Dr. Aksir. You've very broadly outlined your research and some of the findings that you've been able to obtain from your survey. Could you provide us a bit of a more in-depth analysis in terms of any of the recommendations that have been made by Afghans or other sort of institutions and organizations that you've worked with to engage in terms of receiving their feedback and portrayal of the level of corruption? Have you, what other than percentage and numbers, have you been able to gather any other more in-depth understanding of the situation?
To be answered, or to be honest, the short answer is no. One of our priorities at the Asia Foundation is to, or in our department, is simply to provide the raw data. We're not necessarily policy experts, we are research experts. So our responsibility is to provide reliable and clean data that we can then take to the policymakers. We do this in a number of ways. We understand that there are certain limitations, particularly in government's capacity to use data, quantitative or qualitative data. So we have a number of activities, programming activities that we do. We have a data analysis training program. We offer coaching sessions and also custom analyses. When our data comes out, we do debriefings to the government, Office of the President, Office of the CEO, to various ministries. After the data is launched, we also do additional briefings. So while we don't specifically work in policymaking, we kind of work behind the scenes to provide the data. I can't really speak to any recommendations on anti-corruption measures, but I could speak to recommendations on data and on the use of data. Data is very important. Making decisions, especially data-informed decisions, are very important in Afghanistan. In the past, where we may not have had access to reliable and clean data, we have that now. We keep our data available online for everybody. We put it for everyone to use, and if you can't use it, we try to train individuals as much as possible to ensure that you could use it. So my recommendations would mostly be limited to creating more data and ensuring that individuals have the capacity to use and to analyze that data.
Thank you, Dr. Aksir. So we'll move on to some questions from the audience now. I know we don't have as much time as we would have liked, so we'll take a few. The first one, I guess, I will direct at Scott. A question that's quite interesting in terms of the regional partnership and regional sort of support towards Afghanistan. Is how can other countries or neighboring countries support Afghanistan in fighting corruption? I think to some extent there has been recently a lot of anger towards the role that neighboring countries are playing on the increasing corruption levels. So what can be done in terms of building those relations and receiving their support to counter these challenges?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing, although it's probably maybe too much to hope for, especially now in this moment of political uncertainty, would be to stop interfering in domestic Afghan politics by using resources that effectively amount to corruption. And we, in the political science world, talk about proxies and client-patron relationships and so forth, but these are essentially relationships that feed into corruption because they encourage officials to do things that they should not necessarily be doing in their official capacity, but doing them for other clients than the Afghan state. It would be nice to be able to say that there were positive examples from the region and how corruption has been addressed that Afghanistan could look at, but I don't think we can really make that case. And I don't know, it's a very good question, but it seems to me that for the most part, this is a problem that has to begin to be solved within Afghanistan, rather than through regional cooperation. I think may actually be one of the problems that is least amenable to a regional approach. One final comment would be a lot of the corruption of this 1.6 billion that I mentioned, I think a lot of it comes from customs revenues. So I don't know if there may be border issues where specific border relationships at transit crossing points may be technically improved in order to make corruption harder on both sides. That could be one dimension where this could happen. You're muted.
Sorry about that again. Thank you, Scott, for that. The next question seems to be for Andrew. What other measures could be at the disposal of US and international donors in order to compel the Afghan government anti-corruption agencies to do a better job? Or how can we ensure that funds that are being given to the government and certain institutions are better monitored?
I'm not sure that it's the Afghan government's anti-corruption agencies that need to receive the pressure so much as Scott mentioned, it's Afghan political figures or the relationships that are developed outside of the bounds of the Afghan state that really need to be addressed. In some ways, in the last few years, we've already seen a few examples of how the US or other donor states have applied pressure to encourage the government to take actions against corruption as a phenomenon or against those they perceive to be corrupt figures. If you look at the case of former First Vice President Dostum, remember that in 2016, I believe, he was denied a visa to visit the United States. And this was a clear signal that the US used to demonstrate that regardless of his official position, the US and other donors did not approve of Dostum's record, either in the current government or past accusations of human rights violations and other behaviors. And this along with additional forms of pressure the US and persuasion the US leveled at President Ghani actually pushed President Ghani to make a strong and dramatic stand against his own vice president, which when you look back at it is a fairly remarkable and unique course of action that was taken against such a high-ranking official. So there are things that can be done and that we've seen done. As Scott mentioned, and as President Ghani himself has emphasized, another area the President Ghani has said he believes is the key to Afghanistan's financial independence and self-sufficiency is customs revenue, which the latest report, the UNAMA report, I think mentions is only about 18% of the Afghan government's total income and revenues. But because so many bribes are paid and because so much is known to take place at customs ports that are outside of the government's control, it's believed to be a much greater source of potential revenue. So one simple thing that the international community could do is focus their efforts and support on the government and the pressure they apply specifically to the way that customs are operated. I think an area that had been overlooked in previous periods of international support.
Thank you, Andrew. And I think finally, the last question we'll direct at Mr. Shirzad. It's more sort of centered around how can we ensure that our leaders are setting the best example for Afghanistan, and how can we ensure that we hold them into account when incidents of corruption happens, and as Andrew mentioned earlier, the corruption that occurs within sort of ministerial level isn't being addressed as much as it should be. So what mechanisms, I guess the question is centered around what mechanisms can be put in place to ensure senior figures, leaders can be held accountable so that it sets an example to the rest of the country. I think your mic is off, Mr. Shirzad. Yeah.
The political will at the top for fighting corruption is most important. Secondly, this declaration of asset for all high-ranked government officials is very important. It shows that how they keep their integrity and accountability. Also, that's very important that people at the top of the organizations, how they formulate the policies and the strategies to fight corruption in their organization. That's very important. I think simply that's from my side.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shirzad. I think we have one more question. I'll end with that one, and hopefully Scott can give us his final remarks. The question is, how can civil society, media, and youth within Afghanistan fight corruption and sort of promote activism against corruption on sort of a grassroots level?
Yeah, I think this is an extremely important tool, an extremely important alliance. When I had mentioned, Machiavelli's dilemma and where do you find the constituency in favor of reforms, that's where you find it. You find it in the press, you find it in civil society. And these are areas where Afghanistan is actually probably, far ahead of other countries in the region. I think in terms of civil society activism, where there's a genuine energy, backed by a real constituency, which is, the youth of Afghanistan that we know is a large part of the population and stands to inherit what comes next. And really a very vibrant press. And one that has not been afraid, despite threats that it sometimes faces, has not been afraid to take up some of these issues of corruption. And when political leaders know that they can face popular pressure because people have access to information and they realize that their interests are being sacrificed for the good of a few in positions of power, that helps to bring them to be accountable. Let me add one more point, which is, one indirect way in which this donor funding, I think, contributes to corruption is, and this is a point made by Kate Clark in a very good piece recently on the Afghan Analyst Network, when the government is 80% funded by donors and not by taxpayers, why does it need to be accountable to taxpayers? In fact, the donor dependency makes it able to ignore these kinds of constituencies. So if you were able to have, again, continue the development of civil society and the press, and at the same time, this effort that has been underway for some time to try to get the government to be less dependent on donors and a bit more dependent on resources it generates inside, then you might begin to have the kinds of forces that come together to make it much more uncomfortable to be so blatantly corrupt.
Thank you, Scott. And I think that's somewhat of a positive ending to this very sort of difficult conversation on the future of Afghanistan and corruption. So that's all the time we have for now. I'd like to thank everyone who's been able to join us, either watching sort of globally or participating with us in this conversation. And thank you so much for our guests from Afghanistan for providing a much more frontline and grassroots perspective of what's going on back in Afghanistan. And we hope to continue this conversation in our next panel discussions, and we will hold follow-up ones as well. If you do have any questions after this talk, please do send them to us, and we will direct it at the panelists to get in touch with you directly. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shabnam.
Thanks.